first and foremost is availability. Because when we think about in New York City, methamphetamine is not that available, but it is here. But cocaine, for example, is a lot more prevalent. So access to cocaine is greater. That means that there's a greater likelihood that people will abuse cocaine relative to something like methamphetamine. That's so accessibility is one of those things. Another factor that might play a role is that if the drug itself is used to delineate the group's membership. So if you think about youth culture today, and not to pick on hip hop because I'm a fan, in some songs or some people talk about marijuana use, and they talk about it and it's glorified. And so as a result, people who are in that sort of culture might use that drug more often because it helps to delineate the boundaries of the group. And so that increases the likelihood of use. Or if you think about other sort of cultures, businessmen, you may be at meetings in which there are martini glasses passed around. In that culture, the martini glass, having a drink after work or at a meeting, that might increase the likelihood of alcohol being abused in that culture because it kind of helps to define or delineate the membership boundaries. I think that if we do, we may see abuse of the drugs that are more widely available, like alcohol. Certainly during times of crisis, people may indulge a little more than they normally would. So you may see increases in alcohol, but in terms of the illicit drugs, I'm not sure because of their lack of availability. If people who have access, they may use more so than they normally, but that's a difficult question for me to predict. For the most part, people who are using antidepressants, for example, they need those medications and they are helping them with their psychiatric illness. The way we look at those drugs in some instances, like for example ADHD medications, there has been a lot of talk about folks abusing those medications. There's been a lot of talk about the diagnosis, people being overdiagnosed with ADHD. And sure, you may have those instances, but I think in large part, folks are being responsible as possible. And whenever you have human behavior, there is an opportunity for abuses. And I think that in this case, medicine is not exempt. And I just think that this is what we can expect in general from humans, and this is not some aberration. A generational change, people change. Young people, people who are young today won't be the same folks tomorrow. And so as new generations come about, they have to find their own way. Not only with drugs, they find their own way with fashion, they find their own way with the way they wear their hair, a wide range of domains in which they find their way. And drugs is just one of them. It's not special, it's not unique. You see some generations really being into LSD, whereas or the psychedelics in general, whereas other generations are really into the stimulants. But by that same token, you found that some generations were into bell bottoms, other generations were into straight leg pants. And so I think that as each generation find their way, they will also select their psychoactive intoxicants similarly. The drugs themselves have always been there. So I think that the culture influences the drug use in part, but it's difficult to say for me because that's not something that I study directly. But I think that given that drugs are there, and they have been, because the drugs that people are using have been here for centuries. But their popularity changes. In part, their popularity changes too as a function of our focus, our media focus, our educational focus on them, and our concern about those drugs. I think it was in the early 1970s, Edward Breacher, published a paper on how to start a nationwide drug fad. And he talked about how he used the example of glue sniffing in Pueblo, Colorado, in which a few youth were sniffing glue, and then it was reported in the Denver Post, and then it just gained so much popularity. Other newspapers reported articles on this. Then Time and Newsweek and those magazines did pieces. And then the popularity of glue sniffing really increased during this period. But before those articles advertised glue sniffing, young people, most young people had no idea about glue sniffing and nor interest. And so I think our attempt to educate people about these drugs, we have to be careful in our attempt not to glorify them and not to over advertise them like they are Nike tennis shoes or something. You know, when you say the next big drug, we talk about prescription opiates now. We're concerned about them, so they are certainly a problem. That's a growing problem, and that's the current sort of, or the concern that's on the horizon. So that may be a problem in the future. But when we think about stimulants, what we know is that they tend to go in cycles. So cocaine is popular during an era, and then amphetamines come back. Then they will go out of fashion, and then cocaine will come back, which will go out of fashion, and then amphetamines back. And so now we might be due for an increased focus on cocaine in the next 20 years or so. But as you know, it's difficult to predict the future, and I don't have a crystal ball.